So what caused the attitude of the Allies to go from what seems to be characterized by condescension and incomprehension towards the resistance to a position where they really had to include the resistance in their thinking? And I'm thinking about D-Day, for example. They had to sort of take account of what the resistance was doing and its knowledge on the ground.
Well, it's all rather ironic because it was the fault of the Nazis. The resistance up until the end of 1942 had very little impact, and there's a lot of debate. Historians in Britain tend to be rather scornful of the military impact of the resistance compared to what the French view. And I think to be absolutely serious, in military terms, in purely military terms, it was pretty irrelevant. And in numerical terms, it was irrelevant as well. It was still very annoying for the Nazis to have, these problems and these occasional bombs going off and occasional soldiers being shot. Compared to what was happening on the Eastern Front and Stalingrad, this was, very small beer. This was a handful of, it wasn't even a flea bite on an elephant. But the very fact that the Nazi war economy was so overdrawn by the Eastern Front and by the bombing campaign, the heavy bombing campaign by the Allies, meant that in 1943 they were running out of workers. They needed more people to work in the factories and so on. And so they instituted basically what was labour conscription. All young men and young women, in fact, from the ages of 18 to 25 were told, you've got to go and work in Germany. In the past you'd gone and had to do your military service. Now you're going to have to do your labour service in Germany. One bright spark in the Paris Nazi headquarters said, this will do for the resistance. And in fact, it did the complete opposite. What happened was that mainly men, took to the hills. Often, given the option, do you want to go and work in Germany and perhaps be bombed, or do you want to just take to the hills and fight? They took the second option. So all this happened in kind of March to May 1943, and this is the maquis. Right. Which is a Corsican word which means scrubland. The word didn't even exist in continental France in February 1943, but by June everybody was talking about it, and there were these bands of men in the hills who were primarily there not to be sent to do military service or their labour service in Nazi Germany, but who were also therefore wanted to do something. And immediately this became a problem for the resistance and the Allies. How are they going to feed and arm these tens of thousands of men? How are they going to keep them occupied? That really changed people's attitude because they recognized that they had a responsibility as well, that they couldn't just carry on flying in loads of money, which they did. Allies sent in loads and loads of money to the resistance, which was used to pay people to work effectively underground for produce newspapers and so on. But they also had to find something for these men to do. They had to protect them because the Nazis were going to come and try and get them. They had to, if they were going to take action, they had to be properly supplied. And in general, the argument that the Allies and de Gaulle had was, well, not now, wait until D-Day, which of course was a long time coming. And whilst camping out in the hills might have been fun in kind of June 1943, by November, when it's getting cold and the snow's starting to come, it's not very pleasant. It's very dangerous as well because you can be seen much more easily because there's no leaves on the trees and so on. So really this Nazi obligation to get more people to feed their war machine, more workers, changed the situation inside France. And it also meant that the resistance changed from being largely an urban phenomenon, and especially primarily composed, of teachers and intellectuals, an awful lot of them, not all of them, but that was very ex-military people, to actually being a very young, much more working class and rural peasantry-based organization. And peasantry, which had been rather kind of reactionary up until then, now saw its sons, its brothers, the workers on its farms being taken away to Germany or taken to the hills. And so the maquis was fed by the local peasantry, they were supplied by them and so on. So really that 1943 was the time that it all changed.
The point you've just made is made very visibly in the illustrations in the book, because as you say, the early resistance leaders were journalists, teachers, intellectuals. And then if you look at the pictures towards the end of the book, they're teenagers, they're in shorts, and they look like they could be 16 or 17 years old, the people you portray.
Absolutely. I mean, it's also extremely moving in that respect. Most of the active people involved in the resistance were extremely young, and it brings a lump to your throat often reading their accounts. and often the last letters that they wrote, there were times when I found myself weeping when I was, writing those particular sections because it was so moving. There's one particular one, a 16-year-old whose letter, a semi-literate letter to his parents, consists of explaining that they've got to, who various of his friends have got some of his books. One of my friends has got my copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. You should get that back. You need to give half a packet of cigarettes to so and so. Oh, and I'm now going to be taken out to be shot. P.S. I'm sorry I haven't had time to reread this. It's full of spelling mistakes.
You write in the book that although the resistance was very much a minority activity for the French population, it had a growing moral authority as the war progressed. And I wondered if you saw in it a kind of moral counterbalance to the collaborationist Pétain Vichy regime, and that was a sort of rallying point morally, even if in physical numbers they were still quite insignificant.
The importance of the resistance is as a moral and political fact, not a military one. They did carry out very important actions in the wake of D-Day. They basically paralyzed, there was this plan, there were 4 plans for attacking German communications transport networks, and they carried out over 1,000 attacks in the 24 hours after D-Day. So it was extremely important. Eisenhower later said that, for example, some of the resistance actions in the second half of June were the equivalent of 2 divisions. So they were important, but primarily, I think in looking back now, you can say that the real weight of the resistance, of its real importance, was its moral and political fact, both for the French population at the time, but in particular in the post-war period, in how France reconstructed itself. It meant that, on the one hand, the horrors of collaboration were not omnipresent. People weren't completely guilt-stricken that we had allowed this to happen. And on the other hand, that there was this very positive image, this very courageous and heroic image that people could latch onto, and indeed, as many historians have argued, kind of end up with a very distorted image that, in fact, everybody was a resistor. And for a while, the collaboration was effectively kind of wiped out of history. And that's why the Robert Paxton's book on Vichy history in the late 60s created such a shock, because it was really showing the truth of what had happened. Similar things happened as films were made showing that the reality of collaboration and people's ambiguous and difficult choices that people made.